Okay. So I think we can begin. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and welcome you to the opening session of our first annual event, hopefully to be a flagship event in the coming years. And it's really a series of very exciting dialogues hosted by the India Network of Rethinking Economics over the next couple of weeks. My name is Karan, I'm with the India Network, and I'm delighted to host today's session. We have with us a lovely guest today, Ingrid Kvangraven, and we'll be having a bit of a conversation on the importance of pluralist ideas in economics, as well as discussing her own experience with building platforms that have really been pushing this agenda. And so probably a little bit of background on Ingrid before we start. Dr. Ingrid Kvangraven is a lecturer of international development at King's College London, and her research is centered on the political economy of development and on the need for change in the field of economics. She holds a PhD in economics in the New School and is the founder of the Diversifying and Decolonising Economics initiative, as well as Develop Economics blog, and is the coordinator at the Association of Heterodox Economics. It's a lovely background, and with that, I think we can dive right in. And I'd like to welcome you again, Ingrid. Thank you so much for joining us today. And so just to start us off, I think, and I know I gave a bit of a summary before, but can you maybe tell us a bit more about yourself and your experience in trying to change the way economics is taught at university?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me and the invitation, and congratulations on putting together this amazing program. Very pluralist, and I'm very excited to attend the other sessions as well over the next 2 weeks, I think it is, or a week and a half. So yeah, and thank you for the introduction. That was good. So I guess a bit more on my background and like how I came to where I am now, and my oh, apologies for the sirens in the back. That's, yeah, I live in a very busy street, so that's the side effect of working from home. Yeah, so I basically was looking for answers to sort of this massive inequalities in the world as an undergraduate student when I first looked to sort of decide what to do with my life when choosing to go to university. I'm from a very, very small village in Norway, which is like literally 100 people. But my parents were like, my mom was a teacher, and my dad actually worked in public sector, but also when I was 2, he got his like first job in an aid organization. So I also like moved around a lot. So lived in like some of the poorest countries in the world, like Cambodia and Mozambique, but also then Norway, which is like one of the richest countries in the world. So I was like very early on faced with this, massive privilege that comes with being a Norwegian, and was really kind of seeking answers to, why is the world so unequal, unjust? How do we change this? And therefore went into a development studies program that was interdisciplinary, and was mostly interested in economics actually, and took quite a few economics classes and found them very unsatisfactory. And abstracted from like the real issues that I was curious about, and ended up thinking, okay, economics is not the discipline for me. And I ended up majoring in like development studies and human geography, where you could learn, actually, it's quite a pluralist discipline, right? You could learn Marxist theories and like dependency theory, and could write like a thesis on microfinance in Kenya, but from a Marxist perspective. So kind of a heterodox economics approach, except I didn't know that yet at the time, because I didn't know what heterodox economics was, because we didn't learn that in the economics department at the University of Oslo, which is very, very mainstream and still is very mainstream. So it wasn't until I did my graduate degree at LSE in development studies again, because I was like, economics is definitely does not have the answers. But there actually they have a pluralist approach. So I took one course in like super mainstream development economics and one course in basically heterodox economics, although I guess it was called political economy, where the professor of that course was basically the one that introduced me to heterodox economics as an organized body of scholarship. And that kind of blew my mind at the time. And he also talked about the New School, which I had never heard about, which is a heterodox economics department in New York. And I became kind of very interested in that. So that's how I came to kind of discover heterodox economics a bit later than I would have wanted to. I would have, wanted to have started with that. But that also, I think it also blew my mind more that I hadn't heard about it until kind of, in my graduate studies. And also the fact that, so the economics professor teaching the mainstream economics course was very, very dismissive of heterodox economics. And the heterodox economist was very, very dismissive of the mainstream, which also kind of made me realize, this is extremely political, actually, this whole discipline. So that's basically what led me then to a PhD in heterodox economics at the New School, which is pluralist and, well, I mean, it's pluralist, but it's particularly heterodox. So you do learn mainstream economics there, but you also learn Marxist, Keynesian, institutional, and other theories of economics. So I was able to actually explore some theories that have been neglected in the discipline, even within heterodox economics, like dependency theory, which was part of what my PhD thesis was about. And then also I came to know the Rethinking movement and became very engaged in wanting to build the heterodox economics movement among students, but also kind of across the public as well, and kind of raise awareness about it, because it was such a, well, I felt like from where I came from, it was something that just no one knew about, which is what also led me to collaborate with some other graduate students that were in the region as well at the time, to bring sort of heterodox economics to Norway, because it was basically lacking there. There were some heterodox economics professors that were scattered, not professors, scholars, that were scattered across the country, but never in an economics department, usually in public sector or in like a history department or a business school. Many are in exile, like myself, because there's just not a lot of positions available, because it's a very, very mainstream department, and the discipline is very mainstream there. So there I got some experience engaging with mainstream professors about these arguments for pluralism. And then since then, so graduating with an economics from a heterodox institution, you have very limited options in a way, in terms of where you can go. So there are some heterodox economics departments in the US and the UK that do hire heterodox economists from the New School and other heterodox departments, but they're very often kind of marginalized. In the US, they're often liberal arts colleges, whereas at the big research universities, you normally have to go into another discipline, basically, which is why I ended up, like, my first job was in a politics department at the University of York. And now I just joined the International Development Department at King's, where actually there's now like more and more heterodox economists coming in. It's like the head of the department, Alfredo Sadfilio, is building this heterodox group within the department, which is amazing. Yeah, that's a bit more background in terms of how I came to this movement. And like, since, I mean, it's been like 3 years now since my PhD, so I've also started engaging more with the Association for Heterodox Economics, and also I also started another organization with some friends that we did our PhDs together and like met at conferences and stuff, called Diversifying and Decolonising Economics, which has some similar goals as well.
Okay, very cool. And I think dependency theory was an entry point for a lot of people study politics that have come into economics and heterodox economics. So lovely to hear about that. And I think, picking up some of the motivations you mentioned, we are having the discussion today and sort of recognizing, that there is a problem with the way things are in economics. And I think especially that the mainstream discipline is presented as a set of principles that denies agency or space for alternatives. I think in saying that, my question to you really is, what do you think are the key sort of aspects of the pluralist agenda, right? And why is that important?
Great question. And it might change a bit depending on who you ask, but I think more or less people in the pluralist movement agree on some basic principles. One is that there's no one way to understand the world. So therefore, we need more theories. Like, one theory is by definition partial. You abstract from reality and you focus on certain aspects of reality in that abstraction. So because that is a partial theory by definition, you need more in order to understand the world better and to debate, what is the best way of understanding the world. In some instances, one abstraction might be more helpful. Like sometimes you might want to, center class or center a country, a nation. So in other instances, maybe you want to center the individual, like, in neoclassical economics. But the problem with the field today is that the economics is presented as if there is only one way of understanding the world, and that it's not a theory, it's empirical. But, the field is very, it considers itself to be methods driven and to be apolitical. So therefore, it doesn't recognize that it's not pluralist. So therefore, the pluralist agenda is basically exposing that actually the mainstream of the field does center one particular theoretical entry point, which is like sort of late neoclassical economics, and that there are many other entry points that are equally, if not better, more relevant for the world. And the economics field used to be more pluralist. So they used, like, Keynesians used to be considered economists as well. Marxist economics also, was published in top economics journals in the 70s, alongside neoclassical economics, or big debates. So pluralism is kind of bringing these back to the mainstream of the field, and also uncovering theories that were always neglected. Like a lot of theories from the South were always neglected in the economics, sort of the top, quote unquote, of the economics discipline. So that's basically the motivation of the pluralist agenda, to expose the political nature of the discipline, expose other ways of thinking about the world, and basically with the ultimate goal of better understanding the world and also, better thinking of solutions to problems in the world. Yeah.
Sorry,
Sure.
I was taking a bit of time to unmute. Yeah. So you did, I think you did bring up the political aspect a few times, right? That economics in itself is part of this larger system of production of knowledge. And I'm curious to understand, I mean, obviously with your own journey with Rethinking Economics, but also I think your work in starting these other institutions and other organizations campaigning for pluralism, how has your thinking sort of evolved? How has your thinking changed over that journey?
Oh, how has my thinking evolved? Well, that's a great question. I think it's probably something that we should all ask ourselves, and I mean, probably it's going to continue to evolve as well. I think going back to kind of what I said at the beginning, I wasn't aware of how political the discipline was and how political social science is as an undergraduate student. It was only kind of something that I was exposed to as a master's student. So then already then I was like, that was maybe the first sort of personal intellectual revolution for me. And then at the New School is basically when I really managed to, or like had the space to unpack different theories and really understand what was going on. Because actually before I did my PhD, I was working in an NGO in the debt justice movement, and had a lot of kind of lobbying meetings with IMF and things like that, trying to push them to, revise their, austerity policies that they were pushing on developing countries. But even then, I back then I thought I understood these things very well, and I guess I did from a limited frame of like neoclassical economics, critiques of neoclassical economics, but no, what was the actual alternative? How do you actually theorize government intervention and the impact on the economy differently? And I think that like my thinking on that evolved a lot during my PhD when I was exposed to different ways of thinking. And also I think another evolution in my thought probably had to do with, first I was exposed to, heterodox versus mainstream, the difference there, that's very political, very important. And then I started to learn the heterodox, but then also there's all these nuances, and I really, pursuing dependency theory, I really also came to understand better the problems with heterodox economics as well, that it's often also Eurocentric at times, and dependency theory is kind of also neglected in a lot of heterodox economics departments. So there's also this kind of north-south conflict in a lot of thinking. that I think is also important to talk about, and that I also kind of, maybe that was my second personal intellectual revolution, if you can call it that. Yeah.
Okay. I think yes, you're right. I think definitely a question we should all sort of be thinking about. And you mentioned a bit on sort of your work in trying to understand what that system looks like, and obviously your experience both on the academic end as well, identifying some of these barriers to change within the discipline. So I think my question really is, what do you think are some of those biggest bottlenecks to really creating change in whether at the university level or really at the teaching level, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a very good question again. And I can kind of, I can mostly speak from my own perspective, of course. So I'm sure, many of you here in the Rethinking Economics India movement also, have things to add, possibly from your experience. But from kind of UK, US, Norway experience, I would say that there are maybe 4 key challenges or bottlenecks, as you said. And maybe, so the first one would be this ideological one that I kind of already talked about, that economists don't think of themselves as ideological. So any challenge to make economics more political is seen by them as ideological, which is something that the economists don't want. So they don't want pluralism. They already understand pluralism as something that's not objective, that's not rigorous, that's not scientific. So there's just this resistance because of this, basically, is an ideology, I guess. Second is the political economy challenge. So basically, economics is one of the most hierarchical disciplines across the sciences. It's definitely the most hierarchical of the social sciences. So there's an extreme concentration of power in journals, in like grant bodies, in prize committees across the discipline. Basically, the concentration of power is very high. So people with power tend to not want to give up power. So there's the political economy problem. It becomes much more difficult in a discipline like economics to really change the power dynamics. That's a massive problem that we need to address. And of course, that kind of, which is more on the intellectual research side, has a massive impact also for the education side, which is also relevant for the student movement, because economics departments hire economists that can publish in top journals, and economists that publish in top journals tend to teach, they are very unlikely to be able to teach heterodox economics or decolonial economics or anything like that. And of course, economists that train their PhD students train them for this market. So they train them in methods that they will need to teach mainstream economics and to be competitive on the economics job market. So therefore, they wouldn't train them in heterodox theories, even if they wanted to, or even if they could. So I ran a survey with my collaborator Serbi Kazar, who is speaking next week, I think, at this conference as well. Yeah. So we did a survey of economists about teaching economics and what they thought the biggest problems were. I can put the link in there's a working paper that's out. I can put the link in the chat. And we found that what economists thought the problem with economics teaching was largely had to do with like better methods training, teaching like the frontiers of the field, like the newest research rather than just sort of older stuff, and more empirical examples. So stuff that doesn't challenge the core of the field at all, rather than like very few thought pluralism was important. And we asked them, like, do you think it's important to challenge the textbook approach to economics? And most of them said no. We asked them if they thought like challenging thinking like an economist was important, which is this thing that Mankiw talks about in his textbooks. Maybe some of you have come across Mankiw's neoclassical textbooks, where it says that, the important thing is to think like an economist. And by that, he means think like a neoclassical economist in terms of marginal utility and comparative advantage and kind of key neoclassical tools. And in the survey, most mainstream economists said, this is not a problem. We should continue to teach students to think like an economist. Yeah, they basically saw no need for heterodox teaching at all. So that is another massive challenge that has to do with education, but that's closely linked with research as well. And I think another one, maybe a bit more minor barrier, is that the response after the financial crisis there and the student movement kind of grew out of the financial crisis, the response of the discipline has been these minor adjustments to teaching that is often packaged as like reform, like a new economics, even though it's basically like the same with a little bit of adjustment. So that also makes it more difficult to kind of communicate that no, the economics field hasn't substantially changed since the financial crisis. I mean, it's changed in some ways, but it definitely hasn't become pluralist. Yeah, so I would say, yeah, those four are maybe the key challenges.
Yeah, I think brilliant overview, and definitely agree with the last sort of more marginal bit that, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a short while. So I think something you did pick up was that in some ways, heterodox economics also sort of can fall or be deficient in some ways. So, and there have been other critiques of the pluralist movement as a whole. For example, the rethinking agenda doesn't go far enough, or that it weighs too little, say, the environment. And I guess, just wanted to ask sort of where do you stand on this, and where do you feel the agenda might still be lacking?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I think that the movement, the movement has been evolving in the ways that I guess we all evolve as, we face new challenges and discover new things. So I think the movement started in a very narrow way. I mean, it started from Manchester, right, in the UK, and then kind of grew to something more global. And I think traditionally the movement in the beginning probably responding to something very specific, the financial crisis and the discipline not being able to grapple with the reasons for the financial crisis. I think it was narrow because this was kind of the starting point. So it was very focused on, Minsky, Keynes, other alternative theories of finance, and not at all focused on, decolonial economics, dependency theory, or anything like that, which in a way is maybe not so surprising given the context in which it arose, right? And that's, a problem, because in order to understand global finance, we do need to center the unequal system that we find ourselves in. We're not only interested in understanding kind of how finance works in the UK or the US, but also, in Brazil or South Africa, and how those spaces are interlinked also with the City of London and Wall Street. So I think that was a problem, but the movement has been evolving also. So you see that Rethinking Economics has been bringing in decolonial perspectives, anti-colonial perspectives as well. And you see that with this conference right now, that there are, it's a workshop on decolonizing economics, there's a session on decolonizing development. And of course, Rethinking Economics went from being a UK thing to a global thing where you have, Rethinking Economics India is super active, and Rethinking Economics for Africa, REFA, is also very, very active. And they are much more concerned, I think, with the decolonizing agenda, which also the Rethinking Economics UK is also becoming more and more concerned with that. So, which I think in part in the UK is in part response to the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of getting more ground as well. But they did start thinking about it a bit earlier as well. And same with the diversity issues in economics. Economics is not only like the most hierarchical in terms of concentration of power, in terms of neoclassical, like the identity of a neoclassical economist, but it's also extremely white and male, which is another problem that I think the movement is, now starting to grapple with. And then, of course, the climate crisis. I think that the Rethinking Economics movement was concerned with it, but maybe, and I think heterodox economists generally are only kind of, many are grappling with it, but I think the global inequality related to climate change is still something that we need to bring more to the front of the debate, on the Green New questioning the Green New Deal from a kind of anti-colonial perspective, as well as, you know, just a Keynesian perspective about like we need to spend more. So yeah, I think that there are sort of problems with the movement in that sense, but that, yeah, many parts of the movement are also kind of grappling with that and taking it seriously and pushing it forward.
Yeah, and definitely sort of constantly evolving. I think we have to look at the criticism and sort of move forward. So I just wanted to also remind participants that you can ask questions. I think I did not mention it at the beginning, but you can drop them in the chat and I'll sort of bring them up as we go along. And you did mention a bit about the progress side of things earlier, right? As to, you know, things have changed, but maybe a little bit more marginally. And people do point to, say, Rethinking Economics and how maybe in a couple of universities you do introduce more courses and things like that. But I think it'll be good to understand on your end as well. You know, what does progress here look like to you, and how well has the movement done in general, I think.
Yeah, great question. And also, again, it depends on, you know, where you look in the world. I would say that it's made, the student movement has made, or the student and I guess also scholarly movements as well for pluralism and for heterodox economics have made some progress, I think, although of course a lot more needs to be done. But you see, like there are a lot of op-eds, you know, that center heterodox approaches, a lot more workshops now that are open to the public as well, and for students, seminar series as well on heterodox economics. And like I mentioned, yeah, chapters across the world on either Rethinking Econ or something similar that also has like a similar goal of, you know, alternative approaches to economics, bringing them to the fore. So that's, I think that's good in terms of like raising awareness generally in the public and among students. And it's very kind of inspiring to go around to universities and see there's so many students that are really, really eager to learn about alternative approaches. So that's, I think there's a lot of interest, which is because people are kind of becoming, students are becoming increasingly aware of these issues. And yeah, and Norway, where I'm from, of course, like when I was at the university, there was literally no discussion of heterodox economics at all. And now at least there are, you know, student chapters at every major university raising awareness about the fact that heterodox economics exists and that there are problems with the mainstream. So that's some progress. And you see also in the UK that there are like, yeah, certain courses have been introduced to like history of thought. Nothing has been altered in terms of like the essence of what an economics degree looks like. And there are still like not a lot of incentives for students to take alternate courses in alternative approaches to economics, because, you know, if you want to continue with a graduate degree in economics, you need, you know, lots of quants, lots of econometrics, lots of math, and that there's not much space for other alternatives. But there are some alternative courses that have been introduced that students can take. So that's kind of on the, yeah, student side and the public side. I think also in research, there is some more concerted push for heterodox ideas, but never in an economics department. So you could say like Mariana Mazzucato is also an economist from the New School with a heterodox training, is now like has her own center at UCL, University College London, and is kind of creating a center there with lots of heterodox postdocs, PhDs, and faculty members. I have like several of my former colleagues, like PhD students at the New School, now work there. So at least, you know, there's alternative kind of centers, research centers popping up. There's also Stephanie Kelton and her group in New York that are pushing MMT, modern monetary theory in the US, which is also another, you know, heterodox approach. Where I am, as I mentioned before, at King's, it's like we were 5 critical development economists or political economists that were hired this year, so it's, you know, expanding. So there are kind of spaces like that, and at the same time, there are heterodox departments across the world, in India and Brazil and US and UK and Argentina and Mexico, that still exist, that haven't, I mean, there's constant pressures, right? And like a lot of these departments are in constant crisis. Some do go under, but a lot of them, have been able to resist this like pressure to reform. And there's an interesting article by Daniel Guiso on sort of pluralism in Brazil. And it's like under pressure, but still exists. And the other thing I think that's kind of a type of progress is that the term heterodox economics is becoming more well known and more used, which could be also good for raising more awareness and challenging the mainstream as well. So if you look at like the Ngram on Google, which shows you how many times a word appears in a publication, you can see that from the like 1990s and to today, there's like a massive spike in the use of heterodox economics. So the term is becoming more well known and more used. It's still very politically contentious. I still have a lot of colleagues that don't want to call themselves heterodox for political reasons because they think it's like a label for losers and all this thing. But still, there are more people that are using it and like self-labeling as heterodox, as something positive, not just something that's like excluded from the mainstream, but a positive label. So I would say that's that is some progress.
Okay, and I will sort of be going a little bit more into that in a bit, but we do have some questions in the chat. I think broadly, there are definitional questions on what heterodox economics is, and really is there. And I think you did mention the problem of the label, right? Where economists might feel that okay, this is something that they don't want to be boxed into. Maybe that could just be something you want to pick on in terms of the problem of defining heterodox economics, and really does that help or hurt the need for change? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the pluralist, because you asked me about the pluralist agenda earlier, and I think the heterodox agenda probably goes even further than the pluralist agenda in terms of not just promoting alternative theories, but also kind of critiquing the mainstream from this alternative perspective. So the definition of heterodox economics is a very is also something that has been debated a lot. So there's no kind of simple answer to that, but I have done some work trying to define it with my collaborator and friend, Carolina Alves. So we argue that heterodox economics can be considered an umbrella term for theories that, economic approaches that look at the generation and distribution of economic surplus that center power in their theories. So that could be feminist economics or Keynesian, Marxist, dependency, decolonial. So it's a big umbrella term, but the key thing is that it is like the centering of power in economic theorizing. So that I think would be a response to the question, I'm just looking in the chat, about like a difference between neoclassical Keynesian and heterodox. So Keynesian would be a part of heterodox. Marxist would be a part of heterodox. Neoclassical doesn't center power relations. And also neoclassical doesn't necessarily study, it doesn't centrally study the production and distribution of economic surplus. If you look at like the definition of economics at the American Economic Association website, it says it's about the allocation of scarce resources, right? So it's a completely different understanding of economics. And then in addition to that, the mainstream or neoclassical economics has now like been used to study everything. So you have this like, what are those books called? Freakonomics, where you like use neoclassical tools and study anything in like sports. You can study household distribution, you can study anything using neoclassical tools, which is what Ben Fine and others before him called like economic imperialism, where you just use kind of neoclassical tools to study everything. So yeah, so that's, I would say, the big difference between heterodox and neoclassical. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I think we've touched a bit on the tools as well, and there was another question in the chat on how will these models be tested. And I think, I mean, that's also something that comes a lot from the mainstream as to, you know, is this really going to work? Is it going to help our understanding? And maybe like a brief answer that you can give to that. But yeah,
that's a great question, and I think there are lots of models, heterodox economic models that do have an empirical, that do empirical work where they look at different empirical phenomena, and are published in scientific journals. So in a way, I mean, heterodox models have been tested since the beginning of heterodox economics, basically, right? There's always, I feel like heterodox economists, I think it's a misconception that heterodox economists only critique the neoclassical, and it's like big thinking about ideas, but not actually any application. Most heterodox economists do very empirical work. So I think a lot of heterodox economists don't think in the way of like, oh, I'm testing something, like testing a hypothesis. I mean, they often do quantitative work. Some of them do hypothesis testing, but some also do qualitative work and different kinds of methods. So and there's also the issue of like, it's not easy to test which theory is right and which is wrong, because you can have a heterodox theory that looks at something completely different from a mainstream theory, and they can both come up with different results, which is why social sciences is so complicated, because you can't really determine which approach is like the right approach or the most true approach. They're all partial approaches. So that's kind of like, yes, heterodox economists do a lot of empirical work, but I think the idea of being able to test which theory is the most correct is not really, is kind of misunderstanding social sciences, right?
Right, missing the point. And I think, you have done a lot of work on development and dependency. I think there is a question on how heterodox models can maybe better understand developing countries' experiences, and for example, India. Maybe that's something you just want to touch on, as to maybe that's how sort of it's being made a bit more rich, that discussion. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, well, first of all, like to go back to the definition of heterodox econ that I mentioned, it's centering power. Like, how can you understand development without, centering unequal power relations? It's impossible, I think, in my world. I mean, now we come back to the question of whether you can really disprove neoclassical economics, right? I guess you can't. But I think you get a much richer understanding of what's going on in India, or, in the global South generally, if you understand the unequal power relations that these countries have gone through with colonialism, for example, and the legacies of those histories. And I think heterodox economics, I'd like to kind of expand it to not just include sort of Keynesian, Arminskian, or feminist theories, but I think, for example, like colonial drain theory, which comes from India, is a heterodox economic theory, centers power, centers imperialism, and shows how during colonialism, there were massive, massive drains of wealth out of India to the UK. That had massive negative impacts on India, positive impacts on the UK, generated this highly unequal relationship that is helpful still for understanding the world. And like Prabhat Patnaik, for example, who's a scholar at JNU, he kind of builds on the scholarship and continues to look at ways in which this unequal relationship continues to this day. So he takes a Marxist approach, which is also heterodox, to the development problems of India by centering it in this kind of global system of imperialism. So he just has a book out with his wife, with Patnaik, that came out this year. Yeah.
Okay. And I think we have talked a bit about where the movement has been, what that looks like, and what progress has looked like. So I think my next question is really what does the path look like from here? And maybe, I mean, depending on how big you want to go with the answer, you can talk about the movement as a whole, but also maybe what the agenda for economists and teaching and teachers should be going forward. But yeah.
That's a great question, big question again. So what should it be going forward? I think we need to continue, but also learn from, and respond to new insights and critiques that come up to the movement. I think there are, I mentioned weaknesses earlier about, how we approach climate change or sort of decolonial approaches that, the movement needs to take on board more. There's also some aspects like, and there's a lot of misunderstanding of the movement from the mainstream that I think also we can grapple with, like what is pluralism? A lot of the time, mainstream departments say, well, we're already pluralist. We teach lots of different kinds of models. We teach, within new Keynesian economics, or we teach lots of pluralist, we take a pluralist approach to topics. We teach inequality and history, or we teach lots of disciplines. We're interdisciplinary. So there's a misunderstanding of what pluralism actually is, which I guess partly comes from maybe miscommunication from activists, but also probably just the mainstream economists themselves not really maybe paying so much attention to what the actual demands are. Maybe they don't want to, pay attention, because if you actually talk about like the pluralism and theoretical approaches, then they can't say that they're pluralist, of course. So I think that's kind of continue to clarify and push, continue to do heterodox research that is relevant, push it out there, raise awareness about it, and teach pluralist approaches. I think that's, a massive role for heterodox economists to continue to, do workshops, do center heterodox approaches in their teaching, engage with students, supervise PhD students, continue to grow the heterodox community, and through students, because students are basically the future of the discipline, right? So that's something that we need to keep focusing on. I guess this conference is a good example of something that I think the movement is doing well, and it's generating, there's more than 50 participants here thinking about the role of heterodox economics and how to push for pluralism, and we're all going to be thinking about that throughout the conference. So I think that's a great example of something that we can keep doing more of as a movement. Also, I think a way to learn and strengthen the movement is to engage not just scholars but also activists, which I know this conference is also doing, to have a pluralist, not just pluralism in terms of theories, but also in terms of actors that think about what the economy is and how it needs to change. I do think that the pandemic is a kind of opportunity in a way, like it's exposing global inequalities in ways that many of us knew that these existed, and they have existed for forever. But I think the pandemic is laying bare kind of this how brutal and obvious these inequalities are to the general public as well, which is something that I think the appetite for new solutions and new ways of thinking is stronger now than it was actually after the financial crisis, which was kind of a very specific crisis that impacted a lot of people, but wasn't sort of a several year long discussion about sort of global inequalities for most people. I mean, for some of us it was, but the pandemic is a lot more something that everyone thinks about on a daily basis. And of course, the climate crisis, the acceleration of the climate crisis, I think is also something that the movement, really needs to and is, pushing, and it kind of opens the door for alternative ways of addressing this problem. So these multiple crises, I think, basically make open the door for more radical approaches to understanding economics that I think the movement can try to capitalize on. To sound like a capitalist, but I think that's something that we have so many different approaches that we all study and research that I think need to be exposed and discussed in the public, and these specific problems of the climate crisis and the pandemic give us an entry point to discuss that and to bring it to the public as well. So that would be my short talk about what we need to do sort of as a movement to push this forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, great. I think too big a question anyway to sort of answer to. And I think I'm just going to add like a short follow-up to that, because a friend mentioned something I thought was interesting. So you did talk about, you do have the activists, or the people who sort of trying to promote this as an agenda, both in curriculum reform and otherwise. And you do have the academics who are the pipeline or the structure in which all of this is disseminated. And do you think that communication has worked well in the past? And do you think that can improve, or any other comments on that really?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I don't know. I mean, it works well maybe in some pockets of academia, but I think in general there are massive problems with academia that go beyond pluralism. Academia is very elitist and very hierarchical, and there's an incentive structure that incentivizes research over activism and engagement with activists. And there's a lot of like the incentives to engage with society have more to do with like impact on like specific policies rather than like more grassroots kinds of engagement. So I think like in order to better have a dialogue between academics and activists, we really need to kind of shake up and challenge academia itself, which doesn't encourage this at all. And there's, I mean, this ivory tower academic thing, which, we maybe sometimes think of as something that's of the past. I think it's still quite a problem for the movement and for heterodox economics, because a lot of academics, end up sitting in their offices and, writing equations and working with data rather than really engaging with grassroots activism and stuff. Of course, there are lots of exceptions, but I think the structure of the academy is such that it doesn't really incentivize these things. So that's why I think, we really need to also, challenge the university system itself in order to push this forward and to open up for different ways of thinking that aren't just, coming from someone who has gone through like a PhD in economics, because they don't necessarily know more about certain issues and how the impact of certain policies, for example.
Okay, and I think that's very much along the lines of Soumya, what you've mentioned in the chat, but I think I'll move to a closing question for today, which is really, I mean, there are a bunch of people in the chat and students who have asked, how can they sort of get involved with heterodox economics, and how can they sort of move further in their understanding? So maybe we can close with your advice for students and how they can start.
Yeah, that's a great question. And sorry, I couldn't follow all the stuff going on in the chat. So how to get involved? I think there are quite a few books to read. I guess there could be like one starting point to do some book clubs, reading groups. I'm trying to think which book would be a good starting point for that. Maybe actually one of these ones, which is actually written by some people in the movement themselves, The Iconocracy, which came from Rethinking Economics, which is a critique of the mainstream and presentation of some alternatives. But there are a million books about heterodox economics. Maybe you could go on on D-Econ that I mentioned that I'm a part of. We do reading lists twice a year, where we like present sort of the newest radical books, heterodox books that we advise that wouldn't be picked up by a mainstream sort of Martin Wolf's list in the Financial Times or whatever. So that would be one place to start to just do some reading. I guess also joining Rethinking Economics is one thing. Following Association for Heterodox Economics, we're trying to do a bunch of workshops, conferences. We have a conference coming up So I'm a part of it. That's why I'm saying we. We have a conference coming up next year that will be on the ecological challenges in particular, and how heterodox economists can approach the climate crisis. So there are a lot of these workshops that are oriented towards, not just academics, but also students and activists, that are open. Some parts of the conferences will be open to the public. Some of them you have to pay, but it's like usually a low fee. There was recently the IPI conference, which is another heterodox association, the International Initiative for Promoting Pluralist Economics, which was entirely free for everyone. And it also has activist sessions, which is quite cool. So I think one of the kind of good things about the pandemic is that we have, all these workshops and conferences have become available to everyone. Anyone with an internet connection across the world. So that's also something that I would encourage everyone here to, make use of, all these seminars that are, ongoing on Zoom every day, basically. And then, conferences, workshops, books. There are programs to, if you're looking for, places to study, there, you feel free to reach out if you're interested in different degrees in, BAs or MAs or PhDs. Happy to advise and like where it's possible to do a heterodox degree. I guess the Rethinking Economics website probably is quite good, although I haven't looked at it in a while, but I think it has quite a lot of resources. Yeah, thank you for putting the reading list there, Jaya, in the chat. And I think the final thing would be, how to learn more. Also, I guess, organize, and like which the Rethinking Economics India group is already doing, which is a great way to learn. Invite the speakers that you want to hear. You don't necessarily have to be a part of a rethinking group. If you're an economics student in a mainstream department, you can invite a speaker from wherever. If you're doing it on Zoom, if you're interested in feminist economics, invite a feminist economist to give a talk, and then that's a way that you can, basically have a direct engagement with someone who's working on a topic that you're interested in. And I think that that's something that's underestimated because the heterodox community is so small, and a lot of heterodox economists, feel quite marginalized. So if you reach out as a student to someone who does heterodox research that you're interested in, most heterodox economists will be thrilled to join your session or do a seminar in your class or something. So yeah, that's also another avenue to learn more.
Yeah, I think that's been very helpful. I hope you guys gotten that. And I think we have reached the end of today's session. So I want to thank you again, Ingrid, for being with us, and also all of the attendees for joining us today. Just as a quick reminder, if you've signed up on the website, you will receive calendar invites for each session, and you can look at the overall program on the website and join the conversation as well on Telegram. I think links will be dropped in the chat in a bit. And like Ingrid mentioned, stay involved, whether with Rethinking Economics or by on your own within your department. I think it's always a great time to be engaging with these ideas. So thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend wherever you are.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for joining in and putting your questions in the chat and engaging. And yeah, see you around on the conference.
All right. Bye, everybody. See you.
Bye.